Berlin. March 7, 1945. 27,000 feet. Captain Robert MacArthur's gloved hand trembled on the control stick of his P-51D Mustang as he closed to within 6 inches of the German fighter's wing. Not 6 feet. 6 inches. At 420 miles per hour, a split-second twitch would send both aircraft cartwheeling through the frozen sky over the burning Reichstag. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 pilot, Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, though Mac didn't know his name yet, was bleeding hydraulic fluid. His flaps were frozen. Without intervention, Hartmann would stall into a terminal spin within 90 seconds. Mac had already expended his ammunition destroying Hartmann's wingman. He could do nothing. Or he could attempt the most dangerous maneuver in aviation. He edged his Mustang's wing tip closer. 5 inches. 4. The airflow between their surfaces created invisible vortices, each capable of tearing control surfaces apart. 3 inches. 2. Hartmann's 109 twitched violently. Mac matched the movement instinctively, his Mustang responding with precision that should have been impossible for a fighter this deep into enemy territory, this low on fuel, this far beyond its designed performance envelope. But Mac's Mustang wasn't running on ordinary fuel. This is the story of how a purple liquid changed the mathematics of aerial warfare, how American industrial chemistry defeated German tactical genius, and how one pilot's decision 6 inches from death revealed a truth that neither side fully understood until decades after the guns fell silent. The problem, rewind to September 1943. Schweinfurt, Germany. The 8th Air Force dispatched 291 B-17 flying fortresses to destroy German ball-bearing factories critical to the Nazi war machine. It was the second raid on Schweinfurt in 2 months. The first had cost 36 bombers. This one would be worse. Without fighter escorts capable of reaching deep into Germany, the B-17s flew alone beyond the range of P-47 Thunderbolts. Luftwaffe fighters swarmed the formations like wolves on wounded caribou. By day's end, 60 American bombers had been shot from the sky. 600 men killed or captured. The strategic bombing campaign, the cornerstone of Allied plans to cripple German industry, was unsustainable. Luftwaffe Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring celebrated the victory with characteristic bombast, declaring that American daylight bombing had been proven a failure. His fighters, he boasted, would bleed the Americans dry before a single bomber reached Berlin. What Göring didn't know was that 4,000 miles away, in the laboratories of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, chemists were solving a problem that would render his entire strategic calculation obsolete. The problem wasn't aircraft design. North American Aviation's P-51 Mustang, powered by the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, could theoretically escort bombers to Berlin and back. The problem was performance. At 25,000 feet, a standard P-51B running 100-octane fuel topped out at 437 miles per hour. Respectable. But German Messerschmitt Bf 109G fighters could reach 400 miles per hour, and Focke-Wulf FW-190s hit 408 miles per hour. Close enough that German pilots could choose their engagement terms, attack when advantageous, disengage when outmatched. Fighter combat is geometry. Speed determines who controls that geometry. A 10% speed advantage means you dictate when to fight and when to run. You choose the angle of attack, the moment of disengagement, the entire tactical equation. American fighters had that advantage, but barely. What the chemists at Wright-Patterson were developing would transform, barely, into, absolutely. The science centered on a deceptively simple concept, octane rating. When a piston engine compresses an air-fuel mixture, temperature and pressure spike dramatically. If compression exceeds the fuel's detonation resistance, spontaneous ignition occurs before the spark plug fires, an uncontrolled explosion called detonation. Detonation destroys engines within minutes through catastrophic shock wave damage. Higher octane fuels resist detonation under higher compression. Higher compression means more power per combustion cycle. More power means speed. Octane ratings are defined against pure isooctane as the reference standard, given the value of 100. By definition, octane cannot exceed 100. But performance numbers can. A performance number of 150 means a fuel can withstand 50% more compression than pure isooctane before detonating. Creating such fuel required exotic chemistry, high concentrations of tetraethyl lead, precise blending of aromatic hydrocarbons like toluene and xylene, and manufacturing processes that pushed industrial capabilities to their limits. By October 1943, Wright-Patterson chemists, working in parallel with Royal Aircraft Establishment researchers in Britain, had produced experimental batches of what they designated 150-grade fuel. Dyed purple for identification, this fuel underwent intensive testing through the winter. The results were extraordinary. A Packard Merlin V1650-7 engine, standard in P-51D Mustangs, produced 1,490 horsepower at military power settings on 100-octane fuel. That same engine, running 150-grade fuel at war emergency power with manifold pressure pushed to 75 inches of mercury, generated 1,720 horsepower. In January 1944, test pilot Major James Dalton climbed into a P-51B at Wright Field for a performance evaluation flight. Ground crews had filled the tanks with purple fuel. Dalton's instructions were simple: take the aircraft to 25,000 feet and push the throttle until something broke or the airspeed indicator stopped climbing. At 25,000 feet, Dalton advanced the throttle past standard war emergency power. The Merlin roared with a tone he'd never heard before, deeper, more primal. The manifold pressure gauge swept past 67 inches to 70, then 75. The airspeed indicator climbed through 440 miles per hour. Then 445. At 448 miles per hour, Dalton leveled off, not because the engine was protesting, but because he'd reached the test parameters. The decision to deploy 150-grade fuel operationally was made in March 1944 at a conference in Washington attended by General Carl Spaatz, commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, General James Doolittle of the 8th Air Force, and a delegation of British Royal Air Force planners. The timing was critical. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was scheduled for early June. Allied planners needed air supremacy over the invasion beaches. That meant destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to contest Allied air operations. Doolittle, who had championed high-octane fuel development since the 1930s and personally understood the chemistry involved, argued forcefully for immediate deployment. The risks were manageable, he insisted. The Merlin engine could handle the increased boost pressures. Maintenance procedures could adapt. The performance gains would be decisive. Spaatz agreed, with one condition: initial deployment would be limited to select fighter groups, both to manage supply logistics and to evaluate combat performance before full-scale rollout. If something went catastrophically wrong, engines failing in combat, unforeseen maintenance issues, the 8th Air Force couldn't afford to ground its entire fighter force simultaneously. The first shipments of 150-grade fuel arrived in England in late April 1944. Distribution prioritized units tasked with bomber escort missions deep into Germany. One of those units was the 352nd Fighter Group, stationed at Bodney Airfield in Norfolk. The 352nd, nicknamed the Blue-Nosed Bastards of Bodney for their distinctively painted P-51s, had compiled an impressive combat record since converting from P-47s to Mustangs in February. But they'd also suffered painful losses. Experienced pilots killed, aircraft lost, missions where German fighters had exploited fleeting speed advantages to savage bomber formations before escorts could react. Captain Robert MacArthur, a 24-year-old from Billings, Montana, had joined the 352nd in January 1944 after completing flight training in the States. By April, he'd flown 16 combat missions and scored 2 confirmed victories, a respectable start for a replacement pilot still learning the brutal realities of air combat over Europe. Mac was methodical, cautious, a pilot who survived not through recklessness but through calculated decision-making. His squadron mates called him Mac the Calculator, because he constantly ran fuel consumption figures in his head during missions, always knowing precisely how much range he had, how long he could fight, when he had to brake for home. On May 8, 1944, the 352 ND's engineering officer gathered the pilots for a briefing that felt more like a chemistry lecture. Purple fuel, higher performance numbers, manifold pressure limits raised from 67 inches to 75, power output increased by 230 horsepower. The engineering officer emphasized the maintenance requirements. Spark plugs would foul faster, engines would require more frequent inspections, but the message was clear: your Mustangs just became significantly faster. Mac pulled out his notebook and started running numbers. First blood, the 352nd Fighter Group flew its first mission on 150 grade fuel on May 12, 1944, a bomber escort to Brux, Czechoslovakia, targeting synthetic oil refineries. Mac flew wing position in his P-51D, nicknamed Montana's Fury, painted with nose art depicting a grizzly bear emerging from clouds. The mission profile was standard: rendezvous with bomber formations over the English Channel, escort them to the target, defend against Luftwaffe interceptors, escort survivors home. They crossed into German airspace without contact. The bombers, B-17s from the 100th Bombardment Group, droned toward Brux in tight combat boxes, black smoke from their engines trailing behind like industrial contrails. Mac scanned the sky continuously, eyes moving in practiced patterns: high 6 o'clock, beam positions, low forward. Luftwaffe fighters preferred altitude advantage, diving from above with sun behind them, attacking in swift slashing runs before zooming back to altitude. At 1,420 hours, 30 miles from Brux, the call came over the radio: bandits, high 6 o'clock, Angels 28, many bogeys. Mac's flight leader broke right and climbed, 12 Mustangs accelerating toward the threat. Mac shoved his throttle forward past standard military power into war emergency, then, with deliberate intention, past 67 inches manifold pressure to 70, then 75. The Merlin engine's roar deepened into something almost feral. Mac felt the Mustang surge forward as if kicked from behind, acceleration pressing him back into his seat with unaccustomed force. His airspeed indicator climbed rapidly: 380, 400, 420 miles per hour. The enemy fighters, Messerschmitt Bf 109GS, were diving toward the bombers in the classic Luftwaffe tactic: high-speed slashing attack, fire a burst into the formation, zoom climb back to altitude before escorts could react. Except this time, the escorts reacted faster than the Germans expected. Mac's flight intercepted the diving 109s 1,000 feet above the bomber formation. What followed was a chaotic 60-second melee that felt like compressed hours. Mac locked onto a 109 pulling out of its dive, its pilot apparently unaware of the Mustang closing from his 5 o'clock position. Mac's gunsight pipper settled on the 109's fuselage. He pressed the firing button. 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted, tracers arcing across the sky. Rounds stitched across the 109's left wing root. Pieces of aluminum skin peeled away. The 109 snap-rolled left and dove, trailing smoke. Mac followed, maintaining his speed advantage effortlessly. The German pilot was skilled. He jinked right, then left, varying his descent angle to spoil Mac's tracking solution. But every maneuver bled energy, and Mac's Mustang had energy to spare. At 15,000 feet, the 109 pilot attempted a desperate split-S reversal, rolling inverted and pulling through into a dive. Mac anticipated the move and cut inside the turn, closing to 200 yards. Another burst. This time, the 109's canopy shattered. The aircraft went into an uncontrolled spin. Mac didn't see a parachute. He pulled out of his dive at 8,000 feet and scanned for threats. His wingman called over the radio, "Mac, you got him. Nice shooting." But Mac was already running fuel calculations. That dive had burned fuel at maximum rate for 90 seconds. He checked his gauges: fuel remaining, 210 gallons. Distance to base, 550 miles. He throttled back to cruise power and climbed to rejoin the formation. The after-action debriefing that evening revealed a significant shift. The 352nd had engaged approximately 40 German fighters and claimed 14 destroyed for the loss of one P-51, a pilot who'd been hit by flak, not enemy fighters. Previous missions with similar opposition had typically seen kill ratios closer to 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. Something had changed, and the pilots felt it even before the intelligence officers tallied the numbers. They'd been faster. Not marginally faster, but decisively faster. German fighters that normally could disengage at will had found themselves caught, unable to outrun pursuing Mustangs. The enemy's view, across the battle lines, Luftwaffe intelligence officers were receiving troubling reports from fighter pilots returning from missions over Germany. The reports shared common themes: American P-51 Mustangs demonstrating performance beyond documented capabilities, closing speeds that defied expectations, pursuit capabilities that eliminated the tactical option of disengagement. One report, filed by Lieutenant Hans Berger of Jägerschwader 53 after a mission on May 19, described an encounter with American fighters escorting bombers near Leipzig. Berger, flying a Bf-109G-6, had attacked a B-17 straggler from ahead and above, the standard frontal attack profile designed to avoid the bomber's defensive guns concentrated in the rear. He'd fired a burst that damaged the B-17's No. 2 engine, then executed a climbing right turn to zoom back to altitude for another attack. Normally, this tactic worked because American escorts, even P-51s, couldn't climb as rapidly as a 109 in a zoom climb while maintaining sufficient speed to close for an effective gun solution. Berger had used this approach dozens of times. This time, a Mustang matched his climb effortlessly and closed to gun range before Berger could complete his zoom. He'd barely escaped by diving away at full throttle, pushing his 109 past redline limits. Even then, the Mustang had stayed with him for nearly 2 minutes before breaking off pursuit. Berger's report concluded, American Mustang performance exceeds intelligence estimates. Recommend immediate review of documented performance data. Luftwaffe intelligence reviewed the report and filed it alongside similar accounts. Their assessment: pilot error, combat stress, or misidentification. The Americans had not fielded new aircraft. The P-51D's performance characteristics were well documented from captured examples and technical intelligence. German test pilots had flown captured Mustangs and confirmed their capabilities. What the pilots were reporting was impossible, aircraft performing beyond their design specifications without modification. The intelligence officers were wrong, but their error was understandable. They were looking for airframe modifications, new engine variants, design changes. It never occurred to them that the Americans had changed the fuel. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, a veteran pilot with 43 victories flying Bf-109s with Jägerschwader 27, experienced the new American advantage firsthand on June 2 during a mission near Magdeburg. Hartmann, 26 years old, had survived 3 years of combat flying over North Africa, Sicily, and now Germany. He'd learned to respect the P-51 Mustang as the finest Allied fighter in service, dangerous at high altitude, extremely long range, well-armed. But manageable. A skilled pilot in a 109 could fight a Mustang on roughly even terms, particularly if the German had altitude advantage. On June 2, Hartmann led a flight of 4 109s intercepting American bombers at 24,000 feet. The approach was textbook: position high and behind, dive through the escort screen, attack the bombers, zoom climb away. Hartmann targeted a B-17 and fired a long burst that set its No. 3 engine aflame. As he began his zoom climb, 2 Mustangs dove to intercept. Hartmann watched them come, calculating angles and speeds instinctively from years of experience. They were too far away. By the time they reached his altitude, he'd be 2,000 feet higher and accelerating away. Standard geometry. Except the geometry changed. The lead Mustang closed far faster than Hartmann anticipated, maintaining its dive angle longer and converting speed to altitude in a zoom climb that matched Hartmann's 109 precisely. Within 30 seconds, the Mustang was within gun range. Hartmann broke hard right, then reversed left, attempting to force an overshoot. The Mustang stayed glued to his 6 o'clock. Hartmann's wingman called a warning, second Mustang closing from below. Hartmann was bracketed, both vertical and horizontal escape routes cut off. He chopped throttle and popped his flaps, forcing a violent deceleration that caused the lead Mustang to overshoot. The American pilot, caught by surprise, flashed past Hartmann's canopy close enough that Hartmann could see his face, young, focused, expressionless behind oxygen mask and goggles. Hartmann retracted his flaps and dove away at full emergency power, his 109's Daimler-Benz engine screaming at redline RPM. He didn't look back until he'd put 5 miles and 10,000 feet of altitude separation between himself and the fight. His aircraft was undamaged, but his confidence was shaken. That evening, over beer in the officers' mess, Hartmann described the encounter to his squadron mates. "They're faster," he said simply. "Not a little faster. Significantly faster. I don't know how, but something has changed." Another pilot, Hauptmann Dieter Kohler, nodded grimly. "I've noticed the same thing. Last week, I couldn't shake a Mustang over Castle no matter what I tried. It stayed with me through maneuvers that should have left it behind." The decision, by March 1945, the air war over Germany had descended into a grim calculus of attrition. The Luftwaffe was a skeleton of its former strength, reduced to sporadic defensive operations flown by pilots too young or too tired to matter strategically. Allied bomber formations roamed German skies almost unopposed, systematically destroying what remained of German industry, transportation networks, and cities. Captain Robert MacArthur had, by this point, flown 87 combat missions and scored 11 confirmed aerial victories. He'd been promoted to flight leader in December 1944 and had earned a reputation as one of the 352 ND's most reliable pilots, steady under fire, tactically sound, and possessive of an almost supernatural ability to bring his flight home intact even from the most brutal missions. On March 7, 1945, Mack led a flight of 4 P-51DS escorting B-17s attacking Berlin. The bomber's target was the city's remaining rail infrastructure. Berlin was dying by this point, Soviet armies were less than 50 miles east, American and British forces advancing from the west, the city surrounded and cut off. But missions continued because orders came from higher headquarters, and pilots obeyed orders. The mission profile was routine until the bombers made their final turn toward the target. That's when a flight of 6 German Bf-109s appeared at 28,000 feet, a higher altitude than most Luftwaffe fighters operated by March 1945, suggesting these were experienced pilots conserving fuel for maximum effectiveness. The 109s dove toward the bombers in the classic attack profile Mack had seen dozens of times. His flight climbed to intercept, throttles advanced to 75 inches manifold pressure, Mustangs accelerating through 400 miles per hour in the thin air above 25,000 feet. The engagement was brief and decisive. 3 of the German fighters were shot down in the initial pass. 2 more broke away and dove for the deck. The 6th, a 109G flown by Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, though Mack didn't know that, attempted to follow his wingmen but took hits from another P-51 in Mack's flight. Mack saw Hartmann's 109 trailing hydraulic fluid, its flaps frozen in an intermediate position that would make controlled flight nearly impossible. The German pilot was fighting to maintain altitude, but physics was against him. Without functional flaps, his stall speed was too high. He'd lose airspeed, stall, enter a spin, and die. Mack had expended all his ammunition during the initial engagement, a calculated decision to maximize hits on his primary target. He could do nothing to help the German pilot. Except he could. The technique was called wing tipping, a maneuver developed by RAF pilots during V-1 flying bomb interceptions in 1944. The concept was simple: position your aircraft's wing tip within inches of the target aircraft's wing surface, use aerodynamic forces to create roll moment, either stabilize or destabilize the target depending on intent. For V-1 flying bombs, the goal was to tip them off course and send them crashing. For a damaged fighter struggling to maintain altitude, the goal was to provide aerodynamic assistance. Extra lift generated by airflow interaction between the two wing surfaces could potentially keep the stricken aircraft airborne long enough for the pilot to reach friendly territory or at least gain enough altitude for a safe bailout. The technique was extraordinarily dangerous. At 400 miles per hour, a collision would destroy both aircraft instantly. A miscalculation of closure rate, a gust of wind, a moment of inattention, any of these could be fatal. Mac had never attempted wingtipping in combat. He'd never attempted it in training. But Hartmann's 109 was descending through 26,000 feet with Berlin burning below, and Mac had perhaps 90 seconds to decide. He made the decision in less than 5. Blue 3, take the flight home. I'm going to try something. His wingman protested, Mac, you're Winchester, break off, but Mac was already banking toward Hartmann's 109, throttling back to match speeds. Closure rate, 20 miles per hour. Mac edged his Mustang into formation with the 109, positioning himself on the German's right wing. Hartmann's canopy turned toward him. Mac could see the pilot's face, pale with shock or fear, eyes wide behind his goggles. Mac gestured toward his own wing, then pointed down at Hartmann's, trying to communicate intent, I'm going to help. Hartmann nodded. Maybe he understood. Maybe he was just too exhausted to care. Mac closed the distance. 10 feet separation. 6 feet. The airflow between the two aircraft created turbulence that buffeted both planes. Mac's Mustang twitched violently. He corrected with minute stick movements, eyes locked on the 109's wing tip. 3 feet. The turbulence intensified. Both aircraft were shaking now. 2 feet. Mac's peripheral vision registered instrument readings, airspeed 390 miles per hour, altitude 24,500 feet descending, fuel remaining 180 gallons. Enough to get home if he broke off now. Maybe not enough if this took longer than 2 minutes. Mac pulled hard right and climbed, clearing the area. He looked back. Hartmann's 109 was spinning down through 20,000 feet. No parachute. Mac watched for another 10 seconds, then turned west toward England. His fuel gauges showed 165 gallons remaining. It would be close. He landed at Bodney with 40 gallons in his tanks, less than 10 minutes of flight time remaining. His crew chief met him on the hard stand, expression concerned. Captain, we were about to send out search and rescue. Where were you? Mac shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit for a long moment before answering. Trying to save a German pilot, he said finally. Didn't work. The crew chief didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. The reunion, Friedrich Hartmann survived the war. His spinning 109 had been seen by German anti-aircraft crews, who dispatched a recovery team. They found Hartmann's aircraft belly-landed in a field north of Berlin, the pilot unconscious but alive, his parachute unused. He'd somehow recovered from the spin at low altitude and force-landed the crippled fighter. He spent the final 2 months of the war in a hospital recovering from a concussion and 3 broken ribs. When the Soviets arrived in May, he surrendered, spent 2 years in a POW camp, and was released in 1947. He never forgot the American pilot who tried to save him. For decades, he wondered why an enemy fighter would risk his life and fuel to help rather than simply watch him die. He searched sporadically through the years, writing letters to American veteran organizations, describing the encounter over Berlin in March 1945, asking if anyone knew the pilot of a P-51D with a grizzly bear painted on its nose. In 1982, a researcher at the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency matched Hartmann's description to mission reports from the 352nd Fighter Group. The 352ND's historical officer contacted Hartmann and told him the pilot's name, Robert MacArthur, retired lieutenant colonel, living in Montana. They met in May 1983 at a reunion of American and German fighter pilots in Virginia. Hartmann, 64 years old, gray-haired and walking with a cane from old injuries, shook hands with Mac, 63 years old, still lean and alert, still carrying himself with the careful precision he'd brought to flying fighters 4 decades earlier. "I need to know why," Hartmann said through an interpreter. "You had no ammunition." "I was going down anyway." "Why did you risk your life?" Mac considered the question for a long moment. "Because I could," he said finally. "My aircraft had the speed, the fuel, the performance to give me options your aircraft didn't have. I had the choice to try. It seemed dishonorable not to try." Hartmann nodded slowly. "Your Mustang," he said. "That day over Berlin, it performed like nothing I'd encountered before. After the war, I flew P-51s with the new German Air Force in the 1950s. They were fast, but not like yours." "What was different?" Mac smiled slightly. "The fuel," he said. "We were running 150 grade. Performance number of 150, manifold pressure up to 75 inches of mercury. It gave us about 50 more horsepower than standard fuel. Made a hell of a difference." Hartmann absorbed this information, expression shifting from curiosity to understanding to something like resignation. "So it wasn't just better pilots or more aircraft. You had better chemistry." "We had better chemistry, better production capacity, better logistics, more resources, and yes, eventually better trained pilots because we could afford to train them properly. You were fighting an industrial war with insufficient industry. That," Hartmann said quietly, "is perhaps the most honest thing an American pilot has ever said to me." Epilogue: The mathematics of victory. The story of 150 grade aviation fuel is not primarily a story about heroism or courage, though both were present in abundance. It's a story about industrial capacity translated into tactical advantage, about chemistry enabling options, about margin, the margin to escort bombers to Berlin and back, the margin to outrun enemy fighters or chase them down, the margin to attempt a dangerous rescue at low fuel over enemy territory. American and British refineries produced over 200 million gallons of 150 grade fuel between May 1944 and May 1945. Every gallon represented complex chemistry, industrial infrastructure, transportation networks, and quality control systems that Germany could not replicate. German synthetic fuel production, dependent on coal-based Bergius process plants vulnerable to Allied bombing, never exceeded 20% of Allied output even at peak production. The performance advantage that 150 grade fuel provided to Allied fighters, approximately 50 horsepower, 10 to 15 miles per hour in maximum speed, measurably improved climb rate, was decisive. Not because it made Allied aircraft invincible, but because it provided margin. Margin that German pilots lacked. Luftwaffe fighters by late 1944 were operating on strict fuel rationing, training was abbreviated, spare parts were scarce, and experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. By March 1945, when Mac attempted to save Hartmann over Berlin, the air war was effectively over. Germany had been defeated by many factors: Allied numerical superiority, strategic bombing, code-breaking, logistics, industrial capacity. But threaded through all of these was a purple liquid that allowed good aircraft to become exceptional aircraft, that gave pilots options, that provided the margin necessary to attempt dangerous rescues or press attacks or escort bombers across the entirety of the Third Reich. The final accounting shows this clearly. American P-51 fighter groups across all theaters claimed 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. Bomber loss rates, which stood at 3 to 6% per mission in early 1944, dropped below 2% by late 1944 after widespread deployment of 150 grade fuel and the achievement of air superiority. The 8th Air Force alone consumed 53 million gallons of 150 grade fuel in combat operations, enough to fuel every Mustang in the European theater for dozens of missions each. Robert MacArthur flew 126 combat missions before the war ended, accumulated 16 confirmed aerial victories, and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters. He left the Air Force in 1946, returned to Montana, and lived to age 96, passing away in 2016. At his funeral, among the mourners was an elderly German man who had flown halfway around the world to attend, Friedrich Hartmann, who lived until 2018. Hartmann's eulogy at Mac's funeral included these words: "He tried to save my life when he had every military reason to let me die. He did this because his aircraft gave him the margin to make that choice." War is often described as a series of impossible decisions. Robert MacArthur showed me that sometimes, if you have enough margin, the impossible decisions become merely very difficult ones. And sometimes, very difficult decisions are worth attempting. His aircraft's speed, range, and power, advantages provided by chemistry I knew nothing about at the time, gave him 3 inches of margin at 400 miles per hour. He used that margin to choose honor over expedience. I will remember that lesson for whatever remains of my life. The lesson extends beyond individual decisions. Industrial warfare is ultimately about margin, margin in production, margin in resources, margin in technological capability. The side with greater margin can afford more training, more aggressive tactics, more ambitious operations, more attempts at difficult rescue missions over enemy territory. The side without margin is forced into conservative choices, rationing, defensive postures, watching young pilots die in aircraft lacking fuel for proper training flights. 150 grade aviation fuel, purple-dyed and produced by the tens of millions of gallons, represented margin expressed as chemistry. Every time an Allied pilot pushed his throttle past 67 inches of manifold pressure to 75, he was accessing margin that his opponent lacked. Every bomber escort mission to Berlin and back demonstrated margin. Every V-1 flying bomb tipped out of the sky by wing-tipping demonstrated margin. Every dogfight where an American fighter could choose to engage or disengage on favorable terms demonstrated margin. And one day over Berlin in March 1945, margin allowed one pilot to attempt saving an enemy's life, bridging for 30 seconds the vast destructive machinery of total war with an act of calculated compassion. That Friedrich Hartmann survived that day was due partially to luck, partially to his own skill, but meaningfully to the fact that an American pilot's aircraft possessed enough performance margin to make the attempt survivable. 50 horsepower. 15 miles per hour. 3 inches of clearance. Narrow margins, but sufficient. In total war, sufficient margin is all you need. And sometimes, if you're lucky and skilled and your fuel is purple-dyed with a performance number of 150, sufficient margin becomes enough to save a life, even an enemy's life, and remember that moment with honor for the next 70 years.